Hello, everybody. Welcome to Paul Greene-Dennis here. Welcome to my live readings and whatnot. And once again, you know me, we're going to continue chugging along in some educational reading. I would call it mandatory reading of legit history. One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1 by Whitney Webb. And I'm going to pick up where I left off in Chapter 6 of Private CIA. Hello. And with that, why don't I get this started? Chapter 6 of Private CIA. One of the scandals. Oh, by the way, this part is inside Billygate, which deals with President Carter's brother, Billy Carter. So just a heads up. Restart that again. One of the scandals that dogged President Carter in the waning days of his administration was the so-called Billygate affair. Billygate was named for the president's brother, Billy Carter, and focused on the ties he had cultivated with the government of Libya. Billygate became a media circus throughout late 1979 as the Senate inquiry heated up and a widespread dissent rippled through the Democratic Party. A Christian Science Monitor article from the summer of 1980 is particularly revealing, as it addresses the way the scandal prevented Carter from focusing more attention on Reagan during election season and describes the rise of an anti-Carter bloc within his party. Washington reporters are hearing from Democratic leaders all over the United States, in office or out, and usually in private, who say they would really prefer to have Carter step aside or be forced to step aside. This growing anxiety, call it fear, one congressman says, is that the president will not only lose badly, but will bring about the defeat of a lot of Democrats in marginal seats and possibly elect a GOP-controlled House and Senate. Billygate came about in the context of deepening tensions between the U.S. government in Libya, and in particular via an effort launched by Gaddafi's government to influence the American population with the hopes of influencing American policy decisions. Under the leadership of Ahmad al-Shahati, the head of the Libyan Foreign Liaison Program Office, a program was organized to invite prominent U.S. citizens and business organizations to Libya. In March 1978, efforts were made to involve Billy Carter in the program. The connection that was established between the Libyans and Billy was rather tenuous. According to the Senate report on the matter, Michael Papa, a Sicilian lawyer and founder of the Sicilian Arab Association, told an Atlanta-based real estate broker named Mario Lianza that if he could get Billy Carter to come to Libya, Lianza can make a lot of money. Arrangements were made through mutual associates to establish contact between a Libyan ambassador and Billy, and Lianza did receive money for his role. After Billy did make a trip to Libya, he helped arrange for a Libyan delegation to visit Georgia in early 1979. He acted as something of a goodwill ambassador and promoted plans for the formation of a Libyan-Aryan-Georgian Friendship Society. Plans were also hatched for a commodity exchange program, where Libyans would purchase goods produced in Georgia, and Billy would use his connections to help Libya sell its own commodities, namely oil, in the open market. To help facilitate these arrangements, the Carter administration's director of the Office of Budget and Management, Bert Lance, recommended the services of a knowledgeable London banker. Lance would later tell investigators that he had recommended the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, BCCI. As previously noted and as will be discussed in detail the next chapter, BCCI was an incredibly corrupt institution with deep ties to a web of intelligence agencies and linkages to various covert operations, terrorist organizations, drug smugglers, and money launderers. The presence of BCCI suggests that more was likely going on behind the scenes, and Joseph Trento, in his history of the Shackley Network, concurs. According to his sources in the intelligence community, Israeli intelligence decided to compromise the president through his brother Billy. Here we go with Israel. The job was outsourced to the private CIA, with Thomas clients making arrangements to convince the Libyans that Billy Carter should be put on their payroll as a goodwill ambassador. This would be devastating to President Carter and very useful to the Republicans in 1980. A dense nebula of backroom business dealings, power plays, and dirty tricks characterized the events that unfolded around the Billy Carter-Libya relationship. One way to begin exploring that nexus can be found through the Florida holdings of the powerful DuPont family, which by the 1970s and 80s had become involved in the CIA's aviation complex. The family's interests in the state were overseen by Alfred I. DuPont, who set up shop there in 1926. DuPont's early Florida affairs revolved around real estate investments, which soon developed into a sprawling empire with countless holdings that were eventually managed by the Alfred I. DuPont Testamentary Trust. Administrating this vast financial complex was Ed Ball, a prominent Florida financier whose sister Jessie had married Alfred DuPont. When DuPont died in 1935, the trust was left in Jessie's hands, and Jessie turned it over to Ball. Thanks to DuPont's accumulation of different holdings and assets, Ball controlled, according to Florida Senator Claude Pepper, a great machine which he operates and manipulates. Every string which controls this vast empire runs through the fingers of Mr. Edward Ball. Besides the real estate holdings, the railroads, the shipping companies, the heavy industries, the major locus of Ball's influence and powers was the control he wielded over the state's banking system. This had its origins in the 1930s with the DuPont's takeover of Florida national banks, which were then used as the vehicle to buy up beleaguered lending institutions throughout the state. Soon, DuPont managed and Ball administered a sprawling banking complex that held an estimated $530 million in deposits. The DuPont Ball banks may have been intertwined with Paul Helliwell's banking network. A list of Florida National Group banks published in the records of a 1964 U.S. government inquiry into DuPont and Ball as part of a wider investigation into holding company practices lists Helliwell's Bank of Perrine Cutler Ridge as being owned by this umbrella group. Also listed was Miami National Bank, the Helliwell represented bank that had been set up with the aid of a Teamster pension fund loan. Mm, 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 mm. By the late 1960s, Ball's domination of Florida was drawing the ire of government regulators and politicians. Moves were being made to force the DuPont Trust to divest a sizable chunk of its holdings. As a result, Ball turned to his friend Raymond Mason. Mason bought up some of Ball's real estate, and the proposition was made whereby the concerned charter company would take control of the lucrative St. Joe Paper Company. The problem, however, was that Charter, at this point, was a much smaller company and lacked the capital requirements necessary to maintain St. Joe. A potential solution arose with the proposed takeover of Charter by Occidental Petroleum, the oil concern controlled by businessman Armand Hammer, who maintained a spot on the board of Ball's Florida National Bank of Jacksonville. The sale of Charter to Occidental fell apart, though by no means ended the relationship between the two companies, which remained quite cozy. However, the failed acquisition also doomed Charter's planned purchase of St. Joe. Yet, in 1972, Charter and St. Joe swapped stock in one another. By this point, Ball had partially divested the DuPont Trust from Florida National Banks while stepping down as chairman. I wonder why he would do that. Let's read on more to find out. However, they still maintained the dominant position, and he took up a new position as the bank's controlling coordinator. In the course of the Charter St. Joe stock swap, Mason ended up controlling 8% of St. Joe, and Ball controlled 22% of Carter. The same year as the stock swap, Mason and Ball toyed with the idea of purchasing iOS. Just like the Occidental Petroleum affair, this buyout never took place. According to Robert Vesco's biographer Arthur Herzog, Ed Ball had told Vesco, "I had a dream. You and I slept together on a cold night. In the morning, you had all the blankets." Still, Mason and Ball maintained close ties to Vesco, who, after becoming an international fugitive, cozied up to Gaddafi's government in Libya, which was an important source of crude oil for Charter. Interestingly, Armand Hammer was also a player in the world of Libyan oil. To quote from Edward J. Epstein's book, Dossier, the oil magnate managed in the 1960s to maintain a huge concession for Occidental in Libya by paying a multi-million-dollar bribe to a key official in the Libyan court. It was one of the few concessions in the Middle East not controlled by major international oil companies, and Hammer made a fortune that he then used to finance immense barter deals with the Soviet Union. He also uses Libyan oil to undermine the power of established oil companies, and in doing so, he radically changed the rules of the international oil business. How Charter entangled itself in the complex world of Libyan oil affairs cuts right to the core of the Billy Gates scandal, and possibly links to the wider web of renegade intelligence operations and private intelligence networks that have been the subject of this chapter. The linchpin here, however, was a company called Carey Energy, headed by Edward Carey, the brother of New York Governor Hugh Carey, and the mob-linked petroleum seller Martin Carey. Hugh and Martin Carey are both discussed elsewhere in this book. Hugh in chapter 11 and Martin in chapter 7. Alan Block notes that Carey and his oil business were exceptionally close to the Greene-Dennis clan, the Greek shipping dynasty, and its patriarch, Elias J. Greene-Dennis, who at this time was managing the Burma Oil Tankers Corporation, a subsidiary of the major British oil concern Burma Oil, from which British Petroleum sprang. If I'm not mistaken, that was in Iran at that time, under the Shah. As discussed in Chapter 3, the interests of the Greene-Dennis family interlocked with those of Bruce Rappaport, while the family's in-laws and business partners, the Mavrolians, were later linked to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. See Chapter 15 for more on that connection. Through Elias's position at Burma Oil Tankers, the Greene-Dennis family maintained a presence near the center of power in the Bahamas. Burma Oil and the Bahamas Development Corporation co-owned an oil transport facility located in Freeport on Grand Bahama, while Greene-Dennis maintained an apartment in New York for the use of Bahamian government officials. Carey Energy also had a presence in the Bahamas, where it owned a majority stake in a Freeport-based oil refinery called Borco, and this facility would have been directly linked to the transport terminal controlled by Greene-Dennis. Borco processed crude oil from Libya and Iran, yet somewhere along the way, Carey Energy had ran afoul of the Libyan government, as one of its holdings had defaulted on oil payments to the country's state-owned oil company. Facing bankruptcy, Carey began searching for a buyer for his company, and it caught the eye of Charter Oil. How Carey Energy and Charter first connected is unclear. Through Carey's family connections, Carey Energy was plugged into the world of New York politics, while through the company's executive vice president, Jack McGregor, it had a line to the Carter family. McGregor, according to government documents related to the Billy Gates affair, was an informal advisor to Billy Carter during the time that the president's brother was making his own forays into Libyan business. Finally, through its presence in Libya, Carey Energy likely brushed up against the interests of Hammer and Vesco, both of whom moved in and out of the Charter Oil orbit. Indeed, Vesco offered his services to Charter Oil for a fee. He would use his leverage with the Libyans to put pressure on Carey to help move the negotiations along. In a statement given to congressional investigators, Charter Oil Chief Financial Officer J. Stephen Wilson stated that Vesco had contacted Raymond Mason concerning a potential acquisition by Charter of 3 former IOS subsidiaries that were then in liquidation. In June 1978, Wilson and other Charter executives traveled to the Bahamas to meet with Vesco. Wilson and Mason then paid a follow-up visit to the fugitive in September 1978, and then again in January 1979, when they were in the Bahamas for the purpose of working on Charter's acquisition of Bordico. The way that Wilson tells the story, there were never any plans to do business with Vesco due to the financier's precarious legal situation. Nevertheless, these meetings between Charter and Vesco did take place, and during at least one of them, the Bordico acquisition was discussed. Then, in March of 1979, shortly after Charter took control of Carry Energy, Vesco began calling Mason, claiming that he had been instrumental in the acquisition and was entitled to a $5 million finder's fee. Charter, for their part, claimed that they had never enlisted the aid of Vesco and therefore were not required to make any payments. While Charter's denial was accepted by the government, accusations to the contrary continued to arise. These were compounded by the fact that, in the wake of the purchase of Carry Energy, Billy Carter's friend, Jack McGregor, had taken a position at Charter. Several months later, in August of 1979, Billy Carter signed an agreement with Charter to help the company obtain additional Libyan oil. Allegations have been made in the press, reads one intriguing footnote in the Senate report on Billygate, that Billy Carter's oil deal with Charter Oil was engineered by Robert Vesco as part of a larger scheme to influence the U.S. government to deliver planes to Libya. The planes in question were Boeing jumbo jets and C-130 and Lockheed L-100 cargo transport aircraft. Boeing. They had been ordered by Libya from American manufacturers, but had been blocked due to an export ban to the country, which had been established by the Carter administration's State Department in fall of 1978. Vesco had inserted himself into this mix, which sparked a series of plots and counterplots that caused considerable problems for the Carter administration between 1979 and 1980. If they, the State Department, would release the airplanes, Vesco told co-conspirator James W. Brewer, then the unidentified people in Washington can get paid $7.5 million out of an airplane deal, and I can get paid $7.5 million. For years, Brewer had been an on again, off again special assistant for Sherm Moody Jr., while the latter was acting as head of Anico. He also exemplified the Moody family's tendency to climb into bed with organized crime types. Yeah, Boeing, yeah. Brewer had a long history of associations with the criminal element and was a repeat offender for his participation in fraud scheme. One such scheme had got him into trouble in 1978, and in exchange for his freedom, Brewer had agreed to become an FBI informant. As one Senate report reads, Brewer helped the Miami office of the FBI uncover offshore bank scandals involving phony or improperly used cashier's checks, letters of credit, or securities. He offered opportunities to individuals, targets, presumably predisposed to commit crimes, and reported the target's conduct to the FBI. Brewer, in other words, was moved around the board by the FBI like a chess piece and was used to set up sting operations against persons of interest. One such target was James C. Day, a former Texas state representative. Day had become a lobbyist on Capitol Hill for Aneco, and also cultivated deeper organized crime ties. This is why exactly I've been saying the government is organized crime. You serve as a representative on the front, but you're really doing some shady-ish. And it's not at the behest of the citizens who want this. For example, one of his business partners was Leonard Capaldi, who was alleged by law enforcement to be a major representative of the Houston, Texas interests of several Midwest and Eastern mob families. Yeah, persons of interest are, yeah, they really are. During the early 1980s, he would again emerge as a major borrower of Houston's mainland savings, where, as will be discussed in the next chapter, Adnan Khashoggi and others tied to intelligence operations could be found. Day had cultivated contacts deep within the halls of the Carter administration, and in April 1978, he told Brewer that White House Chief of Staff Hamilton Jordan and DNC Chairman John C. White were not too confident that Carter was going to make it again, and they were interested in deals to make money. Crazy. The details of what happened next are muddled. Brewer claims that Day asked him to contact Vesco to try and arrange something for Jordan and White. However, according to Day, the plan to bring Vesco into the mix was Brewer's idea. Brewer, Day, and another Aneco aide named James Wolenhouse traveled to the Bahamas to meet personally with Vesco. It was the first of several trips, with the issue of the planes becoming an increasingly important focus for this unlikely crew. You don't say. Day brought the issue to White's attention and immediately following an October trip to the Bahamas, the State Department released a handful of the planes, and with the FBI, all the while, quietly observing the succession of events. Yet, there is also the possibility that the FBI had a hand in instigating these very events. Call me not surprised or shocked. After the release of the planes, Vesco claimed today that the Libyans had not paid him, and therefore Day himself could not receive his agreed upon cut. Day, meanwhile, suspected that Vesco had in fact been paid. At this point, Day hoped to extricate himself from the affair, but Brewer, perhaps at the request of the FBI, kept Day in play by arranging for one of his associates, a man named James Feeney, to pay him the money owed in exchange for a cut of future profits in dealings with the Libyans, Vesco, and Carter administration officials. Incredibly, Day himself knew that Brewer was an FBI informant. What neither Brewer and Day knew, however, is that FBI himself was soon to become an informant himself, this time for the Southern District of New York, which was hoping to get a chance to nab Vesco. My goodness. There's also the question of why Anico featured so prominently in this operation, with 3 associates of the company and the Moody family, Brewer, Day, and Wohlenhaus, acting as the intermediaries between Carter administration officials like White and Vesco. As previously mentioned, the Moody family had ties to the old power structure of the FBI via Hoover ally Roy Cohn. He is everywhere. And Sherm Moody Jr. was said to supply many little boys of the night to Cohn and other guests visiting his ranch who were so inclined. Freaks. Deviants. And it's also blackmail, deviance, organized crime. Everywhere. Cohn, by the time of Billygate and the plane affair, was gearing up to act as an informal advisor to soon-to-be President Ronald Reagan. As will be mentioned in Chapter 10, Cohn was also reportedly involved in an effort to blackmail Carter during this period via his chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, over Jordan's alleged cocaine use at New York Studio 54. Yeah, always Roy Cohn. Dubious, monster. Yeah, monster. Monsters, I tell you. Monsters running government, which effectively, because of the monsters in government, the government itself is organized crime, fronting as servants of the people. Heard about it, I've never been there either. Back to the reading. Importantly, both Sherm Moody and Cohn popped up in the course of the scheming. Cohn's law partner was representing Kevin Crown, who was under investigation along with Feeney by the Southern District of New York. In September 1979, Brewer attended a dinner with Moody, Cohn, and Wohlenhaus, where both the investigation into Crown and Feeney and the plane affair were discussed. According to a Senate report, Moody told Wohlenhaus that they were gonna go to the federal DA and try to make a deal to get them off the hook on the hot check charges by telling the Libyan plane story and adding a bit to it. Subsequently, Crown wrote a scenario about all the players, the Brewers, the Feeneys, the Days, the Vescos, and gave it to John Doyle, the chief of the criminal division in the Southern District. Given the political connections and orientation of Cohn and Moody, one cannot help but wonder if much of this was carried out to embarrass an already flailing Carter administration. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long at all for word of these schemes to reach the press. Vesco himself directly leaked information to Jack Anderson, who wrote 12 columns on the subject between September and October 1979. They described how Vesco tried to wriggle free of the Justice Department's extradition requests by seeking the assistance of high-level Carter officials, including Hamilton Jordan. To make matters worse for the administration, recordings Feeney made of his conversations with various conspirators were shown to the press by aides of Senator Orrin Hatch, who, as we will see, was connected to Adnan Khashoggi, the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, and other intelligence assets. It is like a convoluted web. As the Washington Post reported, an exotic cast appears in the tapes. The names spoken by Feeney, Vesco, at least two other convicted swindlers, and Libyan diplomats include Billy Carter and John C. White, chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Hatch, in a phone interview, said he wanted no dissemination of unsubstantiated allegations, but thought reporters should be able to sample for themselves the technical quality of the tapes. The quality of the segment was excellent. The obviously sensitive tapes, raw files with a high potential to besmirch the reputations of possibly innocent persons and even to affect the presidential election campaign, had been closely husbanded by federal prosecutors for an investigation that began 19 months ago and has involved formal presentations to a grand jury since last fall. Vesco himself had told Senate investigators about the existence of the tapes, effectively widening the probe, just as he'd done earlier with the Anderson leak. This raises the possibility that Vesco's role here was aimed at getting the U.S. to drop its extradition efforts against him. Yet, if there was more to it than that, the next question is, who was Vesco working for or with? One possibility is that he was aiding Shackley's private CIA network, which of course maintained a deep presence in Libya throughout this whole period, allegedly had information concerning Billy Carter's business there, and had been involved in dirty tricks against the Carter administration. There is at least one demonstrable link between the worlds of Vesco and that of Shackley where Libya is connected. Deeply involved in the sale of iOS subsidiaries during the liquidation phase of the mutual fund's existence was Edward Duncan, a high-ranking official in the UK Conservative Party. Among other things, Duncan played a key role in Margaret Thatcher's early political rise. By 1972, he was serving as the chairman of Kaiser Ullman, a major British banking concern with interests across Europe and in the United States. Kaiser Ullman was also tied to Jacques Delors, a Claremont Club member who would later fund a suspect intelligence-linked company headed by Robert Maxwell's daughter, Christine. Hold up. So not only Ghislaine, but now we got a Christine. Yeah, Margaret Thatcher. Yes. Ducan states his obituary concerning this period. Was at the heart of a mass of intricate and generally shady financial maneuverings. Some of these included the tattered ruins of iOS. They also involved Loro, the massive international conglomerate controlled by the corporate raider Roland Tiny Rowland, another Claremont Club member. Keyser Ullman had become Loro's bank of choice, and Ducan was added to the company's board. He would eventually achieve the position as chairman, overseeing a sprawling network of corporate affiliates and subsidiaries that crisscrossed every economic sector, with a particular focus on mineral extraction in Africa. Yeah, it is overwhelmingly shady. Lonro and Tiny Rowland will be discussed more in the next chapter. For now, it's important to note that Rowland's ties to the world of intelligence and covert operations were plenty. He had deep ties to American, British, and Israeli intelligence services, and his African holdings often acted as cover for Mossad agents. He appeared repeatedly in the course of the Iran-Contra affair, and he had complex, sometimes harmonious, sometimes tense relationships with figures like Adnan Khashoggi. Rowland was also close to Robert Maxwell and reportedly helped peddle the bugged Promise software to his political contacts. All in all, Rowland was a well-heeled operator known for his ruthless, buccaneering ways. It is unsurprising, then, that Lorno's tentacles reached into Libya, right up to the highest levels of its government. Yeah. A Lorno subsidiary, Tradewinds Air Holdings, maintained a heavy presence in the country and counted among its board members Ahmed Gadafadam, the cousin of and security advisor of Colonel Gaddafi. Ducan himself was another director. Tradewinds became a subject of interest in British Parliament, especially after a letter written to the British Secretary of State for Trade and Industry by Mohammed Al-Fayed, chairman of Harrod's department store and, for a time, the husband of Samira Khashoggi, Adnan Khashoggi's sister. Mohammed and Samira's son, Dodi Fayed, would later become romantically involved with Princess Diana of Wales and die with her in the infamous 1997 car crash. What? Mohammed Al-Fayed had been partners with Lorno and Rowland for a period in the 1970s, but by the 1980s, they had become bitter enemies, with Rowland seeking to carry out a hostile takeover of Mohammed's economic interests. In the letter, Mohammed outlined a series of charges against Lorno. While most of these concerned their business practices, they also included allegations of arms dealing and ties with the infamous Edwin Wilson. To quote from Mohammed Al-Fayed's letter, the Lorno subsidiary Tradewinds has been named as a carrier in deals whereby ex-CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson shipped to Libya its weapons of terrorism. Wilson is presently serving 52 years in a U.S. prison for his enterprise whilst, interestingly, a co-director in Tradewinds with Messrs. Rowland, Ducan, and Robert Dunlap, from 1980, April 1981 to May 1983, was the head of Libyan security, Ahmed el Gaddafi, a cousin of Colonel Gaddafi. Wow. Until 1983, Lorno's 40% partner in Tradewinds was Ashraf Marwan, who, however, served only fleetingly as a director, and it is possible that he was acting merely as a front for Libyan interests. It is something of a coincidence that Wilson should have been arrested. Marwan sold his shareholding and Gaddafi resigned as a director almost at the same time. A Sunday Times article of 1984 gave some background on the Marwan Libyan involvement, and it is interesting that Gaddafi cited Marwan's office as his address in the notification of his directorship to company's house. To summarize, Tradewinds, a subsidiary of Tiny Rowlands Lorno, was involved in Libya and was named as a player in arms dealings, including shipping weapons on behalf of Edwin Wilson. In other words, on behalf of Shackley's private CIA. At the same time, Lorno's chairman and Tradewinds director, Edwin Ducan, had previously been involved in liquidations and acquisitions of iOS subsidiaries, thus placing him in the direct orbit of Robert Vesco. Vesco, at the same time that Shackley's group was active in Libya, became embroiled in not one, but two potentially interrelated Libyan business and political affairs that reached into the Carter administration. No problem. The first of these was the strange dealings with Charter Oil, and the second was the plane affair. The latter in particular proved to be incredibly embarrassing for the administration, right at the time when a connected network of individuals and entities, including Shackley and his associates, were working to undermine Carter. It is also worth noting that Charter Oil did not only have ties to the Carters via Jack McGregor and Billy Carter. In 1980, 13.7% of the common shares of Charter were held by American Financial Corporation, the Cincinnati, Ohio-based flagship company of Carl Lindner. According to press reports, Lindner was advising Charter chairman Raymond Mason on some corporate ventures. The secretive Lindner was a major Republican supporter and was a particularly tight business associate of Max Fisher, who was described as having a close personal relationship with Reagan and is regarded as Leslie Wexner's mentor. Wow. That's this section on Billygate. That is deep. Whoa. Now we get into the next section of this chapter, legal affairs. A few short years before he became Reagan's campaign manager and prior to the eruption of Billygate, William Casey had returned to the world of private legal practice. He arrived at the offices of Rogers & Wells, one of New York City's impressive white shoe law firms. Renowned for his litigation division, the Rogers of Rogers & Wells was William P. Rogers, who had been a longtime confidant of Richard Nixon and served as his Secretary of State until 1973. The Wells, on the other hand, was John A. Wells. During his tenure as head of Nixon's SEC, Casey had recruited Wells to oversee a committee evaluating the commission's policies and practices. It was just another step in a long friendship. Casey and Wells had been close since they had first met during Nixon's 1960 presidential campaign. During the course of Casey's nomination for the leading position in the CIA, Rogers and Wells had furnished a list. Woo! Oh, you was around for all of this. During the course of Casey's nomination for the leading position in the CIA, Rogers and Wells had furnished a list of clients with whom he had worked between 1976 and 1981. A perusal of the list reveals that some of Casey's close friends and business associates. It includes, for example, Anthony Fisher, who co-founded a proto-Reaganomics think tank called the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research with Casey. There was also Science Life Systems, which Casey had formed with William Simon, a fellow Knight of Malta, who had served in Nixon's Treasury Secretary and would later reappear in connection with the Covenant House controversy, discussed in Chapter 10. Science Life Systems was a chain of computerized fitness spas, which was pitched to the governing body of the Olympic Games as a service for the athletes. Simon was, at the time, the treasurer of the Olympic Committee. Another client of Casey's was Bear Stearns, the major New York investment bank. Casey's legal work on behalf of Bear Stearns coincided with the promotion of Alan Greenberg to the position of CEO, which he would maintain until the early 1990s. It also coincided with the arrival of Jeffrey Epstein, who rose rapidly through the ranks of the bank until his abrupt departure in 1981. This, curiously enough, was the same year that Casey left private law and returned to government service as CIA director. Everybody's moving at the same time. Isn't that coincidence in this tangled up web of government and organized crime? A close examination of other Casey clients shows a distinctive pattern: the recurrent appearance of figures linked to organized crime, the world of intelligence, or both. One client that straddled both worlds was Deak & Company, an international banking and currency trading firm run by Nicholas Deak. Deak, much like Casey, had served in the OSS, and his company maintained a close relationship with the CIA throughout the post-war epoch. An expose of Deak & Company, published in the New Republic in 1976, stated, Deak is said to have handled CIA funds in 1954 when the agency overthrew Iran's premier Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah to the throne. Yeah. During the Vietnam War, Deak & Company allegedly moved CIA funds through its Hong Kong office for conversion into piastres in Saigon's unofficial market. Deak officials in Hong Kong and Macau helped the CIA investigate Far East gold smuggling in the mid-1950s. Deke and Company also had a side that angled towards organized crime. Between January 1977 and summer 1978, the bank maintained accounts for Isaac Catan. Catan was subsequently identified by authorities as the biggest drug financier in South America. He had worked closely with both the Cali and Medellin cartels since the 1970s, laundering the illicit profits produced by the lucrative drug trade through bank accounts in Miami and New York. Deke accounts were among those being used for these purposes, and there is evidence that the firm might have been aware of what was happening. An Internal Revenue Service, IRS, audit revealed that Deke employees filed false currency transaction reports, an anti-money laundering mechanism that tracked large sum bank deposits, and sometimes even neglected to file the reports altogether. The Casey client list also included DWG Corporation, MVF, and Sharon Steel. Might see his name. A trio of companies that were under the control of the man who invented the modern hostile takeover, Victor Posner. He would spot a company whose assets he judged were underfunded, gain control, and milk it. Read Posner's 2002 obituary, The Economist. Some bits would be sold off, while others would be closed. Previously unconsidered treasures, such as employees' pension funds, would be raided and reinvested in Posner's other companies, it added. The three companies represented by Rogers and Wells reveals the diversity of Posner's holdings. DWG was a cigar manufacturer that has since become the Wendy's. Hold up. Hold up. Whoa. I gotta read that again. DWG was a cigar manufacturer that has since become the Wendy's fast food chain, and MVF, formerly National Vulcanized Fiber, was the creator of Forbon, a fiber used in guitar picks. Sharon Steel, meanwhile, had once been a booming industrial firm that had led the pack in Pennsylvania steel industry. Yeah, there's just something about beef. Posner's seemingly innate talent in corporate buccaneering required easy access to capital. Because of this, by the mid-1970s, he had fallen in the crowd around Michael Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert. By the 1980s, he was one of the Milken's biggest customers, and it becomes difficult to perceive, at times at least, where Posner's interests and Milken's were separate. Another person in this circle that was particularly close to Posner was fellow Drexel Burnham Lambert client Ivan Boesky. Years later, when Boesky was dragged before the courts for his role in a stock manipulation fraud case involving the Irish beer giant Guinness, none other than Max Fisher, whose ties to Leslie Wexner are detailed in Chapter 13, personally intervened on his behalf. Notably, Claire Hazel, a former employee of Epstein's and an alleged key figure in the Epstein-Maxwell sexual trafficking blackmail operation, married into the wealthy Guinness family in the early 2000s. Much like Robert Vesco, Posner crossed paths with the SEC during Casey's time there. The commission had brought a case against a corporate raider, spearheaded once again by Stanley Sporkin, for dipping into employees' pension plans at Sharon Steel. However, the case did not seem to have soured relations between the SEC veteran and the dispersed gang of corporate raiders. In 1980, aside from Casey obtaining the Posner corporate accounts at Rogers and Wells DWG, Posner's close friend Meshula Rickles worked out the guidelines with the SEC then head of enforcement, Stanley Sporkin, and proceeded to take his company, Rapid American, private. Wow. As mentioned in Chapter 2, Rapid American included the remnants of Louis Rosensteel's business empire, and Rickles acquired the Manhattan townhouse that Rosensteel had bugged for blackmail purposes. One close associate of Posner who was worth scrutinizing is the Miami real estate developer, Armour E. White, who had been the finance chairman for the Dade County Reagan for President campaign in 1980. Casey was, of course, the manager of the national campaign. It is likely that Posner and White initially encountered each other when Posner first became interested in Florida land development through his Security Management Corporation. Beginning in the 1960s, White was a constant fixture in Posner's world. Sometime in the 1960s, he became a director at DWG, and later he was granted a position on the board of Sharon Steel. By the 1970s, he was listed as a trustee of Posner's Investment Trust. What makes White important, beyond his prominent role in Posner's financial network, is the ties he maintained. Okay. Whoa, wait. Let's. All right. Sorry about that. Something came on when it shouldn't have. Many of these ties came through his real estate vehicle, Context Industries, which had benefited from the Florida land boom in the 1960s. The real estate affairs of the Sunshine State had, historically, served as an investment outlet for organized crime. Unsurprisingly, Context soon found itself swimming in those currents. The company retained Leonard Palullo as consultant. Palullo, in turn, was identified in a New Jersey State Commission of Investigation report as being closely tied to the Nicodemo Scarfo crime family. Scarfo, allied with the Philadelphia crime family, had been given control of Atlantic City when it was something of a backwater. Under his management, it was transformed into the Upper East Coast's major gambling hub. Donald Trump's Atlantic City's interests were built, in fact, with concrete supplied by Scarfo's companies. Wow. Palullo seems to have brought the worlds of White and Scarfo together, with Context Industries making plans for the construction of hotels and casinos in Atlantic City. He also served as a source of financing for White's company. Context paid the mobster $80,000. I don't think I got to that part yet. Context paid the mobster $80,000 to obtain loans that, when they arrived, totaled around $800,000. The source of these loans was Sunshine State Bank, a shady Florida savings and loan in which Palullo owned a 6% stake. The full extent of Palullo's borrowing from the SNL was immense, and upon its collapse, his outstanding debts were over $12 million. It was not the only financial outfit that made, ultimately, unpaid loans to Palullo. Another was Florida's Great American Bank, owned by former U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland Marvin Warner. It had been one of the banks used by the aforementioned Isaac Catan to launder Colombian drug money. An even more direct organized crime connection found in Casey's client list was SCA Services, a major waste management company. While having all the pretenses of an above-board corporate firm, the SCA's directors and investors have been some of America's largest businessmen. The company has been dogged by repeated scandals, illustrating that its roots have remained squarely planted in the underworld. One such investor was Anthony Bentrovato, who became a substantial SCA stockholder after selling a profitable garbage company to SCA in 1973 for $1.7 million worth of stock. 2 years later, Bentrovato was indicted in a mob-linked conspiracy involving kickbacks from the Teamsters Pension Fund. Indicted alongside him was Teamster official Anthony Provenzano, notable for having been at the center of the initial probe into the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. The association between a mobbed-up waste management owner like Bentrovato and a Teamster official like Provenzano is illustrative of the arrangement between the union and waste management. Waste management in New Jersey. Waste management in New Jersey, the center of the SCA complex, fell under the auspices of Teamsters Local 945. The business agent for this local was Ernest Palmieri, who came from a long line of organized crime figures. Palmieri had been placed in that position by Genovese capo Peter LaPlaca. Close to Palmieri was Crescent Chris J. Roselle, the general manager of a family-owned waste management group that was sold to SCA. Roselle also operated a series of businesses with Anthony Gase, the management of a number of SCA subsidiaries. Both were involved, for example, with MSLA, a company that managed a large New Jersey landfill that housed toxic waste. Linked to MSLA was one of the region's largest waste contractors, Charles Macaluso. Close to corrupt Teamster officials, Macaluso was by no means an ordinary businessman. According to the New York Times, he had been identified in the congressional report as a soldier in the Thierry organized crime family. That would be Frank Thierry, a boss in the Genovese family. Perhaps fearing that these associations would come to light, SCA attorneys filed a legal document in 1978 arguing that Gase was not involved with the company's subsidiaries. However, as Alan Block points out in Poisoning for Profit, the minutes of a corporate board meeting clearly indicate Gase's position. It is notable that this situation occurred during the time when Casey worked with SCA via Rogers and Wells. The connection to Gase might have been obscured temporarily, but the connection between SCA and organized crime was later dragged into the media limelight in December 1980, when Gase's associate, Crescent Roselle, was shot multiple times with both 22 and 32 caliber weapons outside his company offices in Elizabeth, New Jersey. This gangland-style murder occurred less than a week after an FBI informant gave testimony concerning ties between SCA and the mob. Wow. In May 1981, New Jersey State Police Lieutenant Colonel Justin Dentino testified that the Genovese and Gambino families exerted extensive influence across the New Jersey waste management industry and had significant ties to SCA. When it came to SCA's president, Thomas Viola, Dentino suggested that he was not a member of organized crime. He was instead an associate member of organized crime, a business associate. Viola, meanwhile, was quickly prepping for his departure from SCA, and he opted to hire another familiar face to serve as his lawyer, Joseph Califano Jr., whose role in Watergate was discussed in the last chapter. The whole episode makes a brief appearance in Califano's autobiography. Though Viola denied any ties of organized crime, an SCA manager had been shot and killed a few months earlier, and the garbage collection business in New Jersey was suspected of being infiltrated by the mob. I was negotiating Viola's exit. He wanted me to meet him in New York at the offices of Rogers and Wells, which had been retained to do an independent investigation of allegations of mob involvement in SCA. I flew to New York for negotiations, which dragged on into the early evening. Rogers and Wells had found that Viola had no mob connections, had cleaned up SCA, and removed any employees responsible for misconduct. Notably, a very close business associate of Leslie Wexner's, Frank Walsh of Walsh Trucking, would later become of interest to law enforcement for his ties to these same organized crime networks, specifically the Genovese crime family's New Jersey branch. Walsh managed logistics for Wexner's company, The Limited, and when Walsh was under investigation by the New York Organized Crime Task Force in 1984, all notices sent to Walsh in connection with that investigation were addressed to Frank Walsh Financial Resources at 1 Limited Parkway, Columbus, Ohio. The same address of Wexner's The Limited. The Walsh-Wexner relationship is revisited in greater detail in Chapter 13. Two final KC clients worth mentioning are Newfoundland Refining Company and Shaheen Natural Resources. This pair of firms represented the interests of John Shaheen, an independent oilman whose long-running association with Casey dated back to their days together in the OSS. Shaheen's official bio states that he has served as aide to General Donovan, the director of the Office of Strategic Services, Chief Special Projects Branch in OSS Washington, OSS field service in European, Mediterranean, and Pacific theaters. Richard Harris Smith, in his history of the OSS, describes Shaheen's Special Projects Branch as a completely autonomous unit that answered directly to Donovan outside of the regular OSS chain of command. This web just gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Shaheen's activities brought him very close to the circle of OSS insiders that Casey had become acquainted with during his time in London. At the end of the war, for example, Donovan organized a committee to advise Hollywood on the production of spy-themed movies. The members of this special commission included David K.E. Bruce, J. Russell Forgan, Alan Dulles, and Shaheen's. Their efforts successfully inserted a score of OSS veterans into the movie business, while also giving directors and producers a direct link into the inside world of wartime intelligence operatives. Hollywood, as a result, became yet another milieu where the worlds of American intelligence intersected with organized crime. You don't say. Now that I'm thinking about it, is this where the 007 movies come to play because of all this? Just asking, because that has me thinking. But I'll say that for another time. Close connections to Nixon was something else Casey and Shaheen shared, with the latter being part of Casey's Hardy Boys clique. Shaheen, like Casey, had been involved with the Nixon campaigns of the 1960s. When Nixon had briefly returned to private law practice, Shaheen had been one of his clients. He was responsible for connecting Nixon with Joey Smallwood, the premier of the Canadian province of Newfoundland. Smallwood, meanwhile, was engaged in an effort to industrialize the remote province by courting European and American capital. Some of the firms he courted bore the unmistakable mark of organized crime. For example, the controversial John C. Doyle and his company, Canadian Javelin. Doyle's company also included a close associate of Edgar Bronfman's, Mark Millard, as a major investor. Doyle had also enticed Shaheen, whose Newfoundland ventures were the two companies taken on by Casey as Rogers and Wells clients. Wow. The Newfoundland venture was rocky. The Newfoundland venture was rocky for Shaheen. In 1976, his oil refinery went bankrupt, setting off a firestorm of legal problems and a domino effect that soon impacted his other businesses. He desperately tried to raise money from outside sources. At one point, attempted to enlist, with the aid of Casey, the Kuwaiti National Petroleum Corporation to invest in his Newfoundland oil company. When that effort failed, Shaheen turned to the open market in a desperate search for sources of crude petroleum for refining in Newfoundland. It was then that he made contact with Cyrus Hashemi, an Iranian arms dealer with close ties to Iran's post-revolution government. Anyone who has ever looked into the October surprise plot will instantly recognize the name Cyrus Hashemi. Indeed, one could argue that the trail of events that led to that plot began with the encounter between Shaheen and Hashemi. According to the report prepared by the October Surprise Task Force, Hashemi had been identified to Shaheen as someone with good contacts in the oil communities in Iran, Nigeria, and Tunisia. Following their introduction, Shaheen solicited Hashemi in securing contracts to purchase crude oil. The report continues. In 1980, Cyrus Hashemi assisted Shaheen in his bid to regain control of the Newfoundland refinery. According to O. Jackson Cook, an attorney who also assisted Shaheen in this effort, Hashemi assembled a group of investors who made money available to Shaheen to bid on the refinery. The FBI's electronic surveillance of Cyrus Hashemi confirms that Cyrus and Shaheen were in contact in late 1980 regarding the Newfoundland refinery. Wow. Hashemi also made an appearance in the Carrier Energy affair, discussed earlier in this chapter. Roy Furmark, the right-hand man of Shaheen in the Newfoundland venture and a close associate of William Casey, testified during the course of the Iran-Contra hearings that he had encountered Hashemi in the Bahamas on the eve of Charter's acquisition of Bordico 198. According to Furmark, Hashemi was operating as a representative of the Iranian government and had been invited to participate in the negotiations of a CIA asset named Roger Tamraz. Many of Tamraz's other activities, including his connections to the Maxwells, will be discussed in Chapter 16. Shortly after Shaheen became acquainted with Hashemi, he began making overtures to officials in the Carter White House and the CIA concerning schemes to free the hostages being held in Iran. While the CIA was reportedly uninterested in what Shaheen had conjured up, which involved a team of cadres being led by an exiled Iranian general. The October Surprise Task Force report suggests that Hashemi was party to the plotting. An FBI report from the period mentions that Shaheen stated that he mentioned Cyrus Hashemi to persons in the CIA because he determined that Hashemi might be able to play some role in either alleviating the hostage crises or in establishing a dialogue with the Khomeini government and the United States. The task force report then adds an ominous detail. According to FBI agent Louis Stevens, Shaheen indicated during the interview that he mentioned Cyrus Hashemi to Casey approximately twice to William Casey prior to Ronald Reagan's inauguration in January 1981. The significance of this is that Cyrus's brother, Jamshid Hashemi, claimed that he was visited by William Casey and Roy Furmark in D.C. The purpose of this meeting, he relayed, was to discuss the hostage crisis in Iran. The October Surprise Task Force cast doubt on the legitimacy of Jamshid Hashemi's claims, citing the lack of independent corroboration. Far more complicated for the task force were the meetings in Madrid in July 1980. As previously mentioned, the Madrid meetings occurred a month after the fateful Le Cercle meeting where the Reagan campaign was discussed. With Le Cercle, the Safari Club, and Shackley's network all revolving around one another, we are left with a highly complex picture of elaborate inner power plays. You don't say. According to Jamshid, Casey, flanked by Donald Gregg and an unidentified man, attended 2 days of meetings with his brother, Cyrus, and Iranian officials in Madrid in late July concerning the hostages. Much of the debate relating to the October Surprise Task Force revolved around Casey having been in London for a World War II historical conference on the days when he was alleged to have been in Madrid. The task force noted that there were significant ambiguities in the conference attendance records, making it hard to know whether Casey could be consistently accounted for in London. Madrid is only an hour and a half from London by plane, conceivably giving Casey enough time to move between the cities in a relatively insignificant amount of time. While the media soundly rejected the possibility that this occurred, a State Department cable later emerged from this precise time period stating that Casey had indeed been in Madrid for purposes unknown. Interestingly, Jamshid Hashemi claimed to have used a series of aliases, including Abdullah Hashemi, Jamshid Kalash, and Jamshid Parsa. Throughout late July and August 1980, a series of hotels were logged into the guest records of the Hotel Ritz, where the meetings with Casey were said to have taken place. These names included Abdullah Hashemi, Jamshid Kalaj, and Parsa Jamshid. These individuals appear to have checked in and out repeatedly at odd intervals. There was another name that appeared in the guest records right alongside the probable aliases of Jamshid Hashemi. On July 23rd, Robert Gray checked into the Hotel Ritz, and on July 25th, he checked out. Was Robert Gray actually Robert Keith Gray? Speculation swirled in the media as Gray, at the time, was working on Reagan's campaign directly under Casey. The October Surprise Task Force eventually turned its attention to the possibility. They cleared him because his passport showed no evidence that he had been in Spain in the summer of 1980. Others were not so convinced. Susan Trento, for instance, cites counter-arguments made by former Gray employees that he had multiple passports. For Gray, a man who had multiple intelligence connections, as detailed in the last chapter, having multiple passports was hardly out of the question. There were also eyewitness accounts that suggested that Gray was indeed the Robert Gray who had stayed in the Ritz. According to Susan Trento, network reporters followed through by showing a photograph of Gray to people at the hotel who said they recognized him. And that ends that section of that chapter. And I'm going to call it right here for now and finish up, I think, the rest of this chapter on Wednesday. Yeah. That was crazy. With that, see everybody on Wednesday. And at the same time. And have a good night. And like again, especially this week, stay cool. You're very welcome. You're very welcome.